Hello, welcome to Setting Up Azure Resources stream today. I'm your host, Richard Knuckles. We're going to be setting up a resource group in Azure. It's the first thing you want to do on your new Azure subscription. So let's talk about this a little bit. Resource groups are containers that hold and group together all of your Azure services. We'll start here in the Azure portal. You can see we've logged in already. My user account's Azure1 at rknuckles.com. And I've switched here to the default dashboard. So you can see we can look at all of the services that we can create in the Azure portal. We've got lots of groups over here, and here are some of the common ones that you can start off with: virtual machines, SQL databases, and storage accounts. But first, you should think about how you want to group the services that you're going to be creating in Azure. For some setups, you'll need just one or two services up here running. Maybe you need a couple of virtual machines to offload some computing into the cloud. Maybe you'll just need a storage account to store your blogs or your blog files, your video files, audio files, text files, other things like that, because you're running out of storage on-premise. But if you do look for multiple types of services that you're going to be running in the cloud, you should consider how do you structure and group them together so you can find them and manage them easily. Because once you start to scale to multiple services, whether that's tens or hundreds or even thousands of services, especially when you get duplicates of the services, and you also have multiple users who you need to give different levels of access to manage and utilize those services, then you'll want to have a plan in place for how do you group these services. So a resource group is both similar and dissimilar to a lot of services in Azure. Resource groups are, as I said, a service that groups other services together, but it's also more like a tag or a property of all the services that you set up afterwards. The resource group is also a security boundary for your resources. So you've set your resources up, and now you want to provide access to them, either to use them as providing a service, whether it's storing files in a storage account or accessing a database in a SQL database. You want to know how to secure that access, give people access who need it access either at a low level, at a reader level, or at a high level, administrative level. And resource groups fill that requirement in Azure as well as subscriptions. You can see I've actually have two subscriptions. I've filtered now to the pay-as-you-go 2 subscription, which is the second one that I added on, so that I can have a clear desktop here for showing you guys. Pay-as-you-go 2 subscription is not necessarily creatively named, but it's representative of how this subscription is paid for and managed. This is not an enterprise agreement subscription. It is a single account subscription paid for with a credit card. So we'll assume that you are familiar with setting up subscriptions in Azure. You've set up your first Azure account already, and you can log into the Azure portal and set up services on demand. So let's take a look at how do you actually create the resource group. It's really similar to a lot of other services. There are multiple ways to get to it in the portal. You can use this navigation panel on the left here to go to All Resources, where you can see any of the resources that are currently out here and add them individually, either with the Create Resources button here in the center if you don't have any, or the Add Resource button here in the top corner. You can also go to the All Services blade, where you can choose from a menu of any of the services available, and also search for available services. So I'm going to search for resource group here, and you can see it's one of the service types available. So here's a list. Clicking on it brings you to the list of resource groups, and we have no resource groups created in this subscription that I have access to anyway. For this subscription, I am the administrator, so I have full control and full access, full visibility to everything about this subscription. So we're going to create a resource group. This button right here. The create service blade in Azure is pretty standard across most of the services in Azure. You get many of the same options, the drop downs, the formatting, and the text is really similar. A description of the service that you're creating, the basic details, including what subscription it's going to go in, what resource group it's going to go in, and what region the service is going to run in. Those are nearly required for every service and common across almost all of them. In this case, since this is a resource group, we actually provide the name of the resource group rather than choosing it from a dropdown. So that brings us to, let's see, regions. So a resource group is tied to a region, but it's also replicated across all regions. So a resource group is both local to a particular region, and services that are in different regions can use a resource group or be a part of a resource group that's in a different region. But one of the primary uses for a resource group is to manage group and potentially delete a group of services in Azure at a single time. And if you're grouping them all together, it makes a lot of sense to keep them in the same region where the resource group has been set up. That bringing your resources into the same resource group and the same region brings some benefits, especially latency. If you have communication between resources in Azure, say that's between a database and a web app, for instance, having them in the same region means they're going to be generally in the same data center, which means they'll have the least latency in their network communications between them. So we'll choose, since we're running here in the US for this, East US, East US 2, South or West. East is a standard default for a lot of services, especially if that's the way you've configured your account when you set up. The next thing we need to choose is a name for our resource group. And I really recommend from the start, because we're setting up a resource group here with the intention of having multiple services in the future, that you have a considered naming convention for your resources. If they're all in the same resource group, it makes it much easier to filter to see just the resources, services in that resource group. But if you also have a naming convention, it makes it easier to visually pick through a list of all of these services so that you can pick them up in the future. And I prepared a diagram to show the naming convention that I recommend for your resource group and services in Azure. It's made up of 6 different parts. You don't need to use all of the parts, but they go from broadest to narrowest, and the more specific it becomes, the less use you'll have for it, or the less need you'll have for it if you only have a single instance of that service in Azure. So for the most broad, we're going to start with the region where that service runs. So as I said before, you'd like to cluster services that are communicating with each other in the same region so that you have the least latency in communications between those services. So for the services that are going to come in the same resource group, services that are going to be communicating with each other and form an interconnected system, you'll want to choose which region of the world, whether that's Europe, Asia, the United States, South America. The region that you'll want to choose would be in one of those, and you want to keep those resources together. Also, you should think about where is the end user for those resources. If you have outside internet users connecting to those services, that's very common with a web app or perhaps a storage endpoint or some other type of front-end service that your end users are going to be accessing. If it's VMs for remote desktop work or for transferring data in and out, then you'd like to have that region where the services are hosted as close to your end users as possible for the lowest latency, again, from their network to the Azure network where these services are hosted. In this case, our users are in the US in this scenario, and they're in the eastern part of the US, so we're not going to put them out in California. We're going to keep them in the East Coast here, Virginia, Maryland, Atlantic coast. So the location portion of our name is going to be East US. We're going to separate these sections of the naming convention with dashes. There are two overriding methods for formatting names in Azure, ones that allow dashes and ones that do not. In general, naming conventions for Azure services must be internet routable or part of a valid HTML route or URL identifier. So in a lot of cases, your endpoint, be that a web app or a database server, are going to have, as part of their name, a top-level domain and or a subdomain appended to the name, so they'll be addressable with DNS. So storage accounts are the big exception where you cannot have dashes in the name, but most other services that you're going to be setting up on Azure can take a dash in the name, so I recommend using dashes in here. The second portion of the naming convention is the platform that this service or this group of services represent. This would be generally a system that you are building. If you're building a web app that's supporting your blog system, perhaps your platform would be called Blog1, Blogger, Orange Blog, whatever the name of that project is, that particular piece of the enterprise work that you're performing there in Azure. That could be a project at work, a team name, or something else that's a large block of a system or content that needs to be grouped together, or systems that are paid for in the same budget or something like that. So you've got the second level here. Since I'm talking about this, we could call it demo. We could call this intro. how about we call this demo, because this is what we're doing here. We're demoing that. So number 3, third portion of our naming convention, is the release stage. A lot of development work gets both a development level and a production level, sometimes a staging level or testing level as well, when it is promoted from the work of developing the system to the release to the production end user. So this level of naming segments either your group of services for production or development, which can, both of these can run either in separate subscriptions or they can run in the same subscription. So we'll just call this, for our end use here, this is prod. You can also have it called dev. There is a limit in the number of characters you can put out on many of these names. 53 is a common limit for a lot of these. So you don't want to go too long on these. So we're going to be limiting the maximum number of characters we're putting in here. So the 4th level of naming convention is the type. We've got, in this case, something that represents the type of service that this name applies to. In this case, we're looking at a resource group. We could call this group. We could call this resource. We want to have something that represents an abbreviation of the overall resource group. In this case, our service that we're setting up is resource group. So we're going to go with that. If you were using a web app, maybe you have web app. You could use database for those. Whatever a star is, storage. In this case, let's use resource group. So in some cases, you might have a service that applies to a particular subset of the overall system that you're building. So you might have 4 databases, say, supporting a web-based application, an entire system that you're building with multiple services in Azure. So you might have a database that's for reporting, a database that's for new orders, a database that's for serving your blog, something like that. So you've scaled out horizontally these databases, and you're using separate ones for different endpoints, different services running on for your users. In that case, we could add the 5th level of naming convention in here, which is your use, the use case, or the particular piece of the application that one of many of these services is running. And then if you've got multiple of that service, say you've got multiple storage accounts that you needed to run for storing different files from the same project in the same overall system. Perhaps you'd have type was store, the use was reporting, and if you had to have multiple of those because you had multiple hundreds of terabytes of data in those, then you could have a number as the end. Typically 100 services of that lowest level of naming convention is sufficient. So I recommend putting a 2-digit number if you're going to use them, starting with preceding with 0 for 1 through 9. And that's the entire naming convention, because we weren't going to have multiple resource groups for this particular demo. We'll just use the resource group naming convention East US, which means it's going to be in the East US region. This is for the demo project. This is the production resource group. And then this type of service that we're creating is a resource group. So you've got two buttons here. You can check the tags, or you can go to review and create, which will give you one last chance to review before creation. We'll cover tags in a separate video. And then Azure does a validation of the items that you've put in and submits an ARM template for creating the resource, and then gives you a notification that your resource group is ready to go. Resource group has been created. Go directly to the resource group, and here is the overview blade for the resource group. All right, that is it for now. Thank you for watching. We'll be back on soon.
Click subscribe to see more videos like this. If you liked this video, hit the like button. Leave a comment in the section below to let me know what videos you'd like to see in the future.